Hello everyone and welcome. You're watching episode 52 of Bicycle Touring Talk. In this series I tell you about adventures I've lived during my bicycle tours. Last time I told you about a tourist resort on the Caribbean coast in Costa Rica, where I had hoped to spend some time at the beach after crossing Costa Rica coast to coast in only 3 days. After finding a room that was a bit outside my budget, I had not committed to staying a second night, but had left it up to the weather and my mood the following day. Well, that day came and started off cloudy, but dry. It wasn't going to be the beach day I had envisioned anyways, but the weather looked like perfect cycling conditions, especially early on when the temperature was mild. Cycling was absolutely the thing to do, so I checked out of my room, went for a quick breakfast and started. The route took me through banana country. I wasn't sure where the expression Banana Republic came from, but if there was such a place, then this would have to be it. It wasn't this idyllic island place you'd imagine though. Banana plantations are huge monocultures. I got to see the impact of an industry that supplies those fruits to the world. There are entire settlements built just for those who work in the plantations. A look at the history of those plantations reveals that Chiquita, a well-known brand, was first born when the Boston Fruit Company merged with some other North American companies to establish plantations all over Central America. They became highly profitable when rail connections were built across the region and ships were first equipped with means of refrigeration. The banana industry grew so powerful that it soon dominated the local economies and with that influenced politics. The term Banana Republic was indeed coined to describe the dependence of a country's economy on the banana exports, which was a limited resource. US-based companies didn't shy away from using paramilitary groups and even involving the US Army when their interests were threatened. Even today, the banana industry of the world is dominated by only 5 major players. As I was riding by all this, mesmerized by the sheer size of the banana plantations, it gradually started to rain again. By the time I reached the Panamanian border, I was soaked. A busload of German tourists had arrived just ahead of me, and now there was a huge lineup, leaving me standing in the pouring rain for the better part of half an hour. The problem wasn't entering Panama. It was leaving Costa Rica. There was another form to be filled out. The pedestrian crossing between the two countries was a former train bridge that was in pretty rough shape. The wooden floorboards were very slippery and many of them were loose, making it a real challenge to push my loaded bike across. Once on the other side, the entry procedure to Panama was straightforward. A stamp in my passport, and I can't even remember if I got charged anything. The border guard was friendly and pretty relaxed. What followed was a really wet ride to Changuinola, the first major town, again through huge banana plantations. There was even a banana crossing along the way where traffic had to stop for a conveyor system moving bananas across the road. The rain finally let up in Changuinola. I easily found a cheap hotel. It was a bit too early for check-in, but one room was ready. It also happened to be the one that was used to store extra beds. But I wasn't going to complain, soaked to the bone as I was. After a lukewarm shower and changing into semi-dry clothes, I walked around town just to explore Changuinola. It is a border town with a busy duty-free shopping district. It was fun to snoop around and there were plenty of bargains to be had if you needed more stuff. All I needed was a good meal, and I found that too. After a relatively early supper, I decided to visit an internet cafe. The computer and the internet connection worked really well here, until the lights went off halfway through my session, which happened, of course, right during my Facebook chat with Barbara at home in Alberta. The internet cafe was full of disappointed local customers who told me that this was typical here and the entire town was experiencing a power outage. What to do? Well, Panama has the cheapest beer in Central America. It was 49 cents for a can of Balboa at a bar. The bartender didn't want my tip. Perfect excuse to have another one. The next day was March 7th. The weather looked good at first and there seemed to be hope for a drier day. But like a curse, rain started again before I had made it out of town. I stopped for breakfast and ended up snooping around the store until the rain started tapering off. My plan was to go to the town of Almirante, from where I was going to find out how to get to the islands of Bocas del Toro. There had to be a ferry terminal or something, similar to the one in Ometepe in Nicaragua. The ride was only 27 kilometers, but it started off with some pretty good hills. Soon after, they were followed by nice and easy descents. Overall, it was a pretty quick journey. Soon after entering the town, I found the boat terminal. It was a kind of speedboat shuttle to the islands, and there was a lineup of tourists waiting for the next boat. I met some international tourists and eventually secured a spot on one of the boats. The whole time I was worried they might turn me away because of my bike. The boats were not exactly big. When my turn came, they asked me to take all my panniers off the bike. I didn't really like the idea, but it was the only way. Everyone on board was given a life jacket and off we went on a speedy ride that took about 20 minutes or so. Too quick for me to really take in the views, but it was pretty obvious that this was a very special place. This ferry took us to Isla Colón, the one with the most tourist facilities. The weather was nice and sunny once we arrived on the island. Now I had the task of finding a place to spend the next couple of days. There were a ton of hostels in town and around the island. I started around and it turned out that many of them were full. At one place, a lady was going to have a room for me later in the afternoon, but I wasn't ready to commit and told her I might be back. I finally found a great hostel across from the beach. They had rooms for $25 a night, which wasn't bad, a dorm for only $10, and finally they had $5 camping spots. I'm not sure what I was thinking. Most of my stuff was still wet from days of rain, and the odds of having dry weather sure didn't seem great, but cheap as I was, I took the camping spot. At first it seemed like a great decision. The afternoon was beautiful and sunny. I went to explore the village, which consisted of beautifully restored, colorful colonial buildings that were mostly serving as hostels, stores, and restaurants. Definitely another tourist hotspot. I later finally had my Bocas del Toro beach experience. The water was perfect here and the weather was cooperating. Later at the hostel, which was called Mar y Iguana by the way, I met another cyclist. His name was Beat and he was from Switzerland. We spent the evening chatting about our adventures and drinking beer at the hostel bar. Beat was in a tent as well, but his seemed a bit more waterproof than mine and also in a better spot. All was dry when I went to sleep, but I remember waking up at night because my sleeping bag was soaking wet. It was pouring outside. Thankfully it wasn't cold. When I got up the next morning, everything was pretty wet. But miraculously, it dried off before midday thanks to sunshine and a stiff breeze from the ocean. My tent didn't really dry off completely though, but I figured it was going to be fine for another night, even if it wasn't perfect. I spent much of my day riding around the island, exploring places most tourists didn't go to. Later, I spent time relaxing in a hammock on the raised patio the hostel had for its guests. This was a perfect place to meet and mingle with others, as well as overlook the beach, which was basically across the street. I was tired that afternoon and thought it was probably because I hadn't slept very well. My appetite was normal though, and toward the evening I walked into town for a burger.
Wow.
On my way back, I stopped at Tony's Market, a good-sized grocery store. I figured I could come here the next day and buy some groceries to cook for myself at the hostel. But for now, all I was after were some fruits for later and an ice cream for dessert right away.
Wow.
I'm not sure if I was getting sick before the ice cream or right after. But the ice cream certainly didn't help. I still didn't feel that bad, but later at the hostel, my head really started spinning when I had a beer. I went to bed early. With a little luck, it was going to stay dry that night. Well, I guess by now you can count the mistakes I made that evening. Believe me, I paid the price. When I woke up again in the middle of the night, I was shivering. Not only was I laying in a puddle, worse than the previous night, but I was definitely running a fever. Was this food poisoning? Could it be dengue? I had no idea, but at first I was actually determined to pack up and leave as soon as I could dry my tent the next morning, hopefully before the 12 p.m. checkout time. This of course made no sense. As soon as I started moving around, I realized that I wasn't going anywhere. I was sick and had to take it super easy. There was also no way I was going to spend another night in that tent. Thankfully, the lady at the reception told me that she had a vacant room for the following night. $25 was nothing for knowing I'd be in a dry place. The tent and my sleeping bag dried really well again later that day. I spent much time in a hammock catching up on some much needed sleep. It felt like that was all I could do anyways that day. The only things I took in were some bland cookies and several electrolyte drinks. I had developed diarrhea too now.
Not a good day.
There was no way I could get a good ride
in the shape I was in. What was the point anyways? I was in a good place and grateful for it. My friend Beat had left the hostel a day earlier and had planned to take the bus to Panama City from Boquete, a town in the mountains. I was determined not to take any buses, and so far my schedule seemed to work out just fine. There were other travelers that were fun to interact with. This is where I first met a couple from France, Jacqueline and Claude, who were on a long-term adventure and had secured jobs somewhere else in Panama as teachers. By that evening I was feeling much better, but definitely not 100%. I rode the bike to town to find out about the options for returning to the mainland and found that there was a ferry twice a day. No one could tell me the exact schedule for the next day because ferry personnel wasn't present that evening. Again, I stopped at Tony's Market on my way back, but didn't dare to pick up another ice cream. All I bought were some bananas, fresh peppers, a can of beans, and some macaroni. My appetite had somewhat returned, but I had to be careful. I was going to leave the hostel the next morning. That much was sure. But was I going to make it all the way to Chiriqui Grande? First, there was a boat or ferry ride across to the mainland. Then, the terrain was hilly. It would be demanding even on the best of days.
I was nowhere near that yet.
It was on March 11th that I checked out of the Mar y Iguana. I first went back to the ferry terminal, but was told that there was no ferry crossing until 4 p.m. that day. It suited me fine. I wasn't really in the shape to cycle all the way to Chiriqui Grande anyways. So why not just spend an easy day on the island and then look for a place in Almirante for the night once the ferry landed there sometime after 6 p.m. The day was going to be shot anyways, but I would likely be much stronger the following day. To test my stomach, I went for a huge pizza at lunch and spent considerable time exploring Isla Colón some more. Even sitting at a dock here, just watching all sorts of boats go by, was fun. The ferry arrived on time. Boarding were mostly local people, not very many tourists. I found it much easier to board this ferry with my bike than to take off all my panniers and have them shoved around out of my sight. The passage took just over 2 hours and cost all but $2. This ferry was old and rusty, nothing like the one in Costa Rica. It had obviously started its life in Russia because Russian signs were everywhere. The ride was smooth. It was fun to see what else was traveling in those waters. Almirante had a major port where freighters were loaded up with, well, what else? Bananas. Once on the mainland, I asked around to find a hotel. At first, it seemed like there wasn't any, and I'd be out of luck in a place that could be a bit rough at night. I definitely wasn't up to stealth camping here. Best solution was to ask someone local. But as soon as I did, I got this weird feeling that perhaps I asked the wrong guy. Could he be trusted? What were the options? Fully aware that this could be a trap, I followed the guy. Well, he turned out okay. I ended up at a very basic hotel that had one room available. The rate was reasonably low. But shortly after checking in, there was a knock on my door. The owner of the hotel told me that the gentleman who had brought me here had demanded a commission, and now I was supposed to pay half of this back to the hotel owner. I was grateful for having a room at this point and just wanted to be left alone. So I dug up the $5 and paid him. Obviously, this was a poverty-stricken place, and it wasn't a secret that tourists had money. I was very tired that night and was facing a big ride the following day. In my next episode, I'll tell you how this journey went on. Was I even up for the challenge of crossing a mountain range again? The plan was, of course, get to the Pacific side again. There was the city of David and then the Pan-American Highway more or less following the coast. Join me for the adventure. I appreciate it big time and would love to have you as a subscriber. Wondering how I got here? Check out the playlist and some previous videos. And I'll see you very soon. And check out the playlist Destination Central America.
Jörg Schlagheck.
The one and only.
Thank you.